What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 10 top 30 wide receiver rankings. Let's just dive right into it here. I will say before I go through tier 1, just want to mention a couple of players who I'm assuming are not going to give it a go this week. The first one, Chris Olave, got put out cold in Week 9. His second concussion this season. Would be shocked if he turns around this week. The other guy would be T. Higgins with that hamstring injury. Short week, did not practice on Monday, just doesn't seem like he's trending in the right direction. Now, looking at tier 1, I think a lot of these wide receivers have really nice matchups. We're going Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Nico Collins, Amon-Ra, and A.J. Brown. For Jefferson here, the Jaguars have allowed the 5th most points per game to the wide receiver position. For Jamar Chase, the Ravens have allowed the most points per game. Nico Collins with a nice matchup. Obviously, this is assuming that he is going to be back off of IR from that hamstring injury. If he's active, if he's healthy, he obviously has to be a lock in your lineup with what we saw early on in the season. For Amon-Ra St. Brown, the Texans are top 6 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. And then A.J. Brown here, he's day-to-day with a knee injury, so something to monitor. But if he's healthy, good to go. He's obviously going to be a lock in your lineup. In his healthy games, he has been a fantasy monster. Now, looking at a pretty large tier 2 here are like mid-tier wide receiver 1s through our high-end wide receiver 2s. Going to start off here with Cooper Kupp, and I will say on paper this is not a great matchup. The Dolphins are bottom 4 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, but the Rams are projected to put up points here. They have the 3rd highest implied point total. Cooper Kupp has looked great since coming back from injury. Obviously, this past week, the Puka ejection was pretty big for him, but he's going to command volume and be a solid option, regardless of Puka's status. Then I have Malik Nabers going up against the Panthers. Now, the offensive line has been an issue for Nabers over the past couple of weeks. He's still getting peppered with targets, but he's not really being used down the field. They just don't have the time. Obviously, Daniel Jones at quarterback. Not an ideal situation, but I do think this matchup here against the Panthers is solid for Malik Nabers. The Giants actually have their highest implied point total of the season, so that's a good sign. Like I said, he's getting peppered with targets, 24 total in the last 2 weeks. I do think this is a spot here where Malik Nabers can have a boom game and kind of get back to some of those ceiling performances. Then after Nabers, I have Tyreek Hill. I will say he's been a little bit underwhelming since Tua's been back. Obviously, he was pretty much like unplayable without Tua. The last 2 games, 6 for 72, 4 for 80. So still startable production, but it would be nice to see one of those like nuclear Tyreek Hill games. Hopefully we get that this week. My wide receiver 9 is going to be Garrett Wilson, and he's really been balling out. He's been super impressive in 3 games with Devontae Adams. In those 3, he has put up 13.1, 16.3, and 30 PPR points. That 30 bomb he dropped last week was just insanely impressive. 2 one-handed touchdowns, catch of the year on the second one. So Garrett Wilson has looked great. Think he's a really strong wide receiver 1 play. Then I have Puka Nacua going up against the Dolphins. The Puka situation over the past couple of weeks has been rough because 2 weeks ago, you get the situation where he's kind of, a surprise, like active on Thursday Night Football. He's healthy, but it's like, all right, is he going to be 100%? Is he going to be limited? His betting props were really low, so it didn't seem like he was a very strong play. He goes out, has a really nice game, then he re-aggravates his knee injury at practice. You're going into this game thinking like, all right, I guess I'm playing him because I played him last time. And then it's not even the knee that does him in this time. It's the fact that he gets ejected for throwing a punch. So that was unfortunate, but still a very talented player. He's produced when he's been on the field. I do still think he's a wide receiver 1. After Puka, I have Terry McLaurin going up against the Steelers. He has just been a super consistent option. 13 plus PPR points in 7 straight games. If he's not getting the volume, if he's not getting the yardage, he's getting into the end zone like we saw this past week. If he's not getting into the end zone, he's putting up a big receiving day. So Terry McLaurin, do think he's a wide receiver 1 at this point. Then I have Drake London going up against the Saints. He's currently day-to-day with a hip injury. Left the Week 9 game early. At least it was after getting a touchdown, so it's not like a Puka situation or like an A.J. Brown where they leave early on and the production isn't there. So assuming Drake London can play, I think he's in like this fringe wide receiver 1 area. Then I have Brian Thomas Jr. going up against the Vikings. I know he is coming off a bad game in Week 9. Obviously came to that one injured with a chest injury, but this is a prime matchup here against the Vikings. I think this is a smash spot for the wide receiver position, and Brian Thomas Jr. is obviously the Jags wide receiver 1, so I think he is a very nice play this week. Hopefully he's going to be logging some, full participations at practice. That would definitely be a good sign. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be Zay Flowers, and he has been an absolute monster. In 4 of his last 5 games, he has put up 100 plus receiving yards. He has 5 games this season with 18 plus PPR points. And early on, it looked like he was going to be like this boom or bust option where he had a pretty high ceiling, but the floor was pretty sketchy. As of late, he has just been ultra consistent. I know they brought in Deontay Johnson, but like the word out of the Ravens organization seems like they view Deontay as the wide receiver 3. With the way Zay Flowers is playing, I don't know if Deontay is going to like cut in and take his usage. So I guess you still have somewhat of the same concerns where if they go ahead early, it could just be a super run heavy game script. But even in those spots, like Zay Flowers is still producing early on in games in the first half. So at this point, I like him as a high end wide receiver 2. Now moving into tier 3, still some solid options here. My wide receiver 15 is going to be Devonta Smith. Now this ranking is obviously going to depend on the health of A.J. Brown. If A.J. Brown is out, you definitely bump up Devonta Smith at the very least into tier 2. He's the wide receiver 15 in points per game. Aside from one just complete clunker, he's been ultra consistent. 14 plus PPR points in 6 of his 7 games. A very strong wide receiver 2. Then I have CeeDee Lamb going up against the Eagles. Kind of a tough spot with Lamb here because he has his own injury he's dealing with. You have Dak Prescott, who has already been ruled out for week 10. And with Dak out against a fairly tough Eagles defense, the Cowboys have the 4th fewest implied points. We saw early on in the season that without the quarterback play of a guy like Tua, an elite wide receiver 1 in Tyreek Hill really kind of struggled. Now, I don't know if the results are going to be quite as extreme, in the negative direction here for CeeDee Lamb, but it's definitely concerning. The quarterback play is not going to be there. It's obviously going to be a massive downgrade at that position. So he is still a very, very talented wide receiver, but the quarterback change, the fact that he's already going to be banged up heading into this one if he does play, I feel like he's in this like high-end wide receiver 2 area. Maybe we get more information if he's looking super healthy. Then we'll reevaluate, but it's just a tough spot. Unfortunate that he's losing Dak at this point. And then after Lamb, going to be going with Devontae Adams going up against the Cardinals. He finally had his first nice game here with the Jets. 22.1 PPR points. That was after he put up 6 and then 9.4 in the first 2 games. So with what we've seen in a 3-game sample size, it does seem like Garrett Wilson should be viewed as their number 1 fantasy option. That doesn't mean that Devontae Adams is like unplayable or anything, but I do think there should be a little bit of separation. So Garrett Wilson is like a back-end wide receiver 1. Devontae Adams is a mid-tier wide receiver 2. I think that's pretty fair. Then we have Debo going up against the Buccaneers. I think this is a good spot for Debo. A solid matchup here. The 49ers have the 2nd highest implied point total. And then you have Christian McCaffrey coming back. Now, maybe you think that's a negative for Debo, but I actually think getting some of the attention off of him, he's still going to be the clear wide receiver 1, but you have CMC, who's obviously a threat as a runner, can also be very involved as a pass catcher. I do think that's just going to raise the overall ceiling of this offense, and I think that's going to benefit Debo here with Ayuk out for the season. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Josh Downs going up against the Bills. Now, this was some pretty confusing usage here from Josh Downs. He only had a 67% route participation. Honestly, this entire, the game, the, week leading up to it for the Colts, this was just an absolute disaster. You bench Anthony Richardson, your young quarterback, who, you knew would need a lot of development after 8 full games. You go with Joe Flacco because he gives you the best chance to win, and then the offense just completely stalls on Sunday Night Football. They look terrible. And then a part of that was Josh Downs had a 67% route participation. That's not even starting wide receiver caliber routes. And I don't know how you look at these wide receivers. Pittman has not been all that great. Downs has been amazing. I don't see how he is getting wide receiver 3 snaps. It just makes no sense to me. He was targeted 8 times on 20 routes. So the dude had a 40% target rate. He still turned it into 6 for 60. You'd assume that number would bounce up, but it's not a great spot, right? 67% route participation, that's concerning. You hope it was some sort of oversight and that he'll be back up 75, 80 plus. Just a very rough overall week for the Colts offense. Just a terrible look pretty much all the way around. But Josh Downs still managed to give you a decent fantasy day in PPR, even in just a complete floor performance. Now, looking at tier 4, going to start off with George Pickens here going up against the Commanders. In 2 games with Russ at quarterback, he has gone 5 for 111 and a touchdown, and then 4 for 74. 2 solid games. he's at least commanding those targets down the field, which is going to give him some week-to-week upside. Then I have Tank Dell going up against the Lions. I was very high on Tank Dell. I like the matchup this week. He finally had a big game in week 9. I'd been waiting, pretty much all season long. You had the injury to Nico Collins, the injury to Stephon Diggs, and he finally did something. Went 6 for 126, in a spot where he was obviously the focal point. Offensive line looked terrible in the last game here for the Texans. Even with Nico Collins back, I still think Tank Dell is going to be relevant. I still believe in the talent here. As the wide receiver 2, I think he's a fine back-end wide receiver 2 play. Then we're going to go with Ladd McConkey going up against the Titans. We have seen a pretty significant uptick in the passing volume from this offense. The first few weeks before the bye, they were just like ramming it down the defense's throat the entire game, like super run heavy. Justin Herbert, super low passing volume, but he has 5 straight games with 27 plus attempts. Ladd McConkey already is the wide receiver 25 in points per game, so he's producing. I think he should only get better rest of season. Then after Ladd McConkey, going to go with DeAndre Hopkins, and I think people are going to assume that this is a low ranking, and it does probably seem low after the big game he just had. 9 targets, 8 for 86, 2 touchdowns. This is really just due to the concern of a Pat Surtain matchup. He's been pretty locked down. I know Zay Flowers just had the huge game, but Surtain was not shadowing him in that one. He definitely could shadow DeAndre Hopkins. So that's my concern. But if you do have D-Hop on your roster, obviously you have to feel great about him going forward after that big game in week 9. Then we're going to go with Darnell Mooney going up against the Saints. Now, obviously, this is going to depend on the Drake London injury. Had a big game with London leaving early on. If London is out, I definitely will bump up Mooney when I update these rankings. But throughout the whole season, Mooney's kind of hovered in that fringe wide receiver 2 range. He has 18 plus PPR points in back-to-back weeks. Obviously, one without Drake London. So we'll see how that London injury goes moving forward. Then tier 5, 3-man tier here. 2 of them are Bills. We have Khalil Shakir going up against the Colts. He continues to just have a very high PPR floor, 10 plus points in 7 of his 8 games. Then I have Courtland Sutton going up against the Chiefs, and it's not a great matchup, but Courtland Sutton has been on a tear over the last couple of games. In back-to-back weeks, he has 10 plus targets and at least 100 receiving yards. So not a great spot against the Chiefs. I don't think this Broncos offense is going to perform overly well, but we are in a spot where Sutton's getting peppered with opportunities, could still have a decent day. And then the last guy here, Amari Cooper, kind of disappointing. He missed week 9 with a wrist injury, so it would have been interesting to see what his usage was because week 1, was playing limited snaps, still had a really nice day. Week 2, saw a little bit of an uptick in usage, but it still wasn't great, and then didn't really produce with it. It would have been nice to see him take that leap in week 3. I think the hope here, though, is that even though he didn't play in week 9, hopefully he's fully acclimated into this offense and will be able to get starting opportunities here in week 10, but there's still some level of uncertainty there. We also don't even know if he's going to play this week. So this is where I have Amari right now. And then the final tier here, tier 6, going to start off with Marvin Harrison Jr., and he has just been super boomer bust so far this season. He has 14 games with 15 plus points, and then he has 5 games with less than 6. 4 games if we are taking out the game where he left really early on with a concussion. But this is just not a matchup I'm super excited about. The Jets have allowed the 3rd fewest points per game to the wide receiver position, so he's boomer bust in a not so great matchup. Tough for me to rank him any higher here. He's just not getting any free opportunities. He is just being used so predominantly down the field that it's is he going to come away with a few big plays, or is it just not going to happen? There's nothing free. He's not getting the Malik Neighbors 10 plus targets a game. It's just not happening for him. And I don't think that's something we can bank on changing, at least, in the near future. After Marv, going to go with Jordan Addison going up against the Jags. It's a nice matchup. 5th in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. Jordan Addison is coming off a solid game. Not super consistent week to week, but someone in a favorable matchup that I'm fine playing. And then the wide receiver 30. This was a tough spot. The wide receiver position does not feel great, especially with 4 teams on bye. I went with Jalen Waddle. Now, it's pretty much undeniable that Waddle has been bad with Tua, and he has been bad without Tua, but I'm not ready to fully write him off. He's had 3 full games with Tua at quarterback. I think week 1 was a nice performance. The last 2 weeks have not been great. This one was even worse because he had a couple of catches, and then on the last play of the game, he runs backwards for 23 yards. So I think he ended with 2 receptions for -4 yards. It really should have been 2 for 20 with a touchdown, which still is not good, but like not as bad as having negatives in the yardage department. So I still am a believer in Waddle. The talent's been there. We look back at the last few years. He's been a nice option, but if you're, done with him, pissed off, I get it. I have him on a decent number of my teams, and it has not been pretty. Some of the honorable mentions here, Calvin Ridley just looks like he's getting peppered with targets. It's just a really, really bad offense. And then I guess you can make an argument for one of these Bears wide receivers, maybe DJ Moore, although it seems like he looks completely disinterested. As a Bears fan, this offense just looks like it's in shambles at this point. Maybe you could throw Roman Dunze in there, could potentially be the wide receiver one fantasy-wise rest of season. But that's going to wrap it up for my top 30. We'll update these after the Thursday night game. So thank you all for stopping by. Any questions, drop them down below. I will see you guys in the next one.